Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out today. I am Laura Cox. Thank you for coming to the second annual post-traumatic stress disorder event. This is the PTSD Healing Connections, and really I am honored to see all of you joining us this year. I created this event last year to create an inclusive conversation around post-traumatic stress disorder, and so often we think exclusively of military veterans. I am a proud Army brat, and my dad is here, retired Army. I'm super grateful that my family was able to join us today. That made me emotional. But when we think of PTSD, we think exclusively of military service, and there are so many people who are missing out on the treatment and the care that they need because they don't fall under the umbrella of military veteran. So there are so many things that you could have chosen to do today, and you chose to be here, and for that I'm really grateful. I just want to go through a little bit of the logistics of the event to start off with. When you came in, you were given a program and a raffle ticket. Inside your program, there's a feedback card. Your input really matters to us. We want to know how you heard about the event and what you thought about the event so that we can make it even better next year, and we can make sure that we're getting the word out in the most effective and efficient ways possible. So please leave that at the door on your way out. And then you were given a raffle ticket. At all of the for-profit vendor tables, you're going to see a little glass jar, and then NAMI has several glass jars at their table from different businesses that donated to our event. Each jar coordinates with a raffle prize. So put your ticket in the jar that you want to win the prize to the most, and then at the end, about 3:45, we're going to draw the winners. You do need to be present to win. So if you leave and your name gets drawn, sorry, I get to keep your raffle prize. So I created this event last year, and the community really rallied around it. And this year, thanks to the partnership of NAMI and my phenomenal planning committee, I have been able to make this even bigger than it was last year, so I'm really grateful for that. And I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about my personal journey through healing from trauma, because the silence around trauma can be deafening. And it's really critical to be able to speak about our trauma so that we can start to heal from our traumas. So I invite you to take a moment, settle into your seats, take a slow, deep breath, and take another. Check in with your physical experience. Check in with your emotional experience. Take one more slow, deep breath, and know that this is a safe space and that this is a healing space. PTSD. 4 letters that mean so much. It's my personal journey through post-traumatic stress disorder that's led me to where I am today. I'm here standing in front of you because of the layers of trauma that I've lived through and I've grown through. I believe that it's through the sharing of our healing experiences and the sharing of our stories that we can connect with others and find healing. I'm here today to share some of my story with you, and I hope that my story can help somehow. I was 19 and so completely naive when I got engaged. 3 months into a relationship with a man who was much older than me. And over the course of the year that I lived with him, he had a schizophrenic break. As he became more and more out of control in his life, he took more and more control over mine. I was cut off from the outside world. I stopped eating. I went from being 20 pounds overweight to being 60 pounds underweight. and I lost all of my innocence. I was skin and bones and a trembling mess when I moved back home with my parents. I thought I was clear when I ended the relationship. He thought he could win me back by following me everywhere I went. I was ashamed for exposing my family to his instability, and so I shut them out as I went through the process of filing for a restraining order. And I have never felt so deeply alone through self-imposed isolation. Thankfully, I have an amazingly supportive family, and they held me up in spite of my resistance as I began to heal. It wasn't easy, and I was not easy to live with in the aftermath of that trauma. I was often very irritated and quick to lash out in anger. I'd lash out and then I would feel guilty, but I didn't know how to express how sorry I was. I would stay up night after night until I finally crashed, and then I would sleep for days. Sleeping invited in the nightmares. Being awake meant having to remember. Little did I know I was displaying some of the classic signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Soon after moving home, the Twin Towers came down. I think we can all remember where we were standing in horror as we watched the events of that day unfold. As a nation, we collectively mourned, and post-traumatic stress disorder became more openly discussed as we came together in our grief and in our healing. I went back to school for massage therapy, and it was there that I discovered emotional release. Addressing the physical tension in our bodies, addressing the physical tension in my body, unwound the emotional tension that I was carrying bundled up inside. Never have I cried so deeply as I did with that very first emotional release. It is one of the most powerful emotional moments of my entire life. Eventually, I sought out the help of a safe place, which is Lake County, Illinois' version of Women and Children's Horizons. That's where I found Glory. Glory was my first therapist. She was my first advocate for me. She would often compare my experiences in that relationship to the experience of a prisoner of war. I was cut off from all support. I was starved. I was surrounded by insanity and abused and subjected to psychological warfare. I didn't feel like I deserved her help, but she said that I did, and I trusted her. So I kept going. Healing is like peeling back the layers of an onion, and there always seems to be more underneath the surface, and working through each layer will often make you cry. But at the center of that onion, there's always that bright green living center. And if you can peel through those layers of pain and sorrow, you will find life in the middle. And that life will fight through anything to survive. As I healed through the layers of trauma and abuse, I learned to look inward in a way that I had never done before. Old childhood traumas that had been suppressed started to come to the surface. I was physically safe enough to emotionally process these experiences. I left Glory's care to work with a new therapist who specialized in childhood sexual abuse. Through all of this, I moved to Kenosha. I started working at the Grand Geneva Resort as the team lead in the massage department. Locally, I opened a massage practice where I attracted clients who were also healing from trauma. I had dreams of going to school for acupuncture and nutrition, eventually, maybe someday. I was involved in a car accident and another, and I suffered from a concussion. I spent as much energy as I could focusing on growing and working and healing. This gets me every time. At the spa, I worked alongside a beautiful young woman. She had so much to live for, and I didn't see how much she was hurting until she was gone. She was barely 21 and lost to suicide. I grieved, and I worked, and I healed. Jamie's death hit me so profoundly. And that soon pushed me forward and into action. That eventually, someday, maybe, became a reality, and I took that leap into grad school. During my first few months in school, my dearest friends lost their beautiful baby boy. My sister had a baby precariously small and far too early. My friend's brother committed suicide. My father had a stroke. My boyfriend cheated on me. My cat died, and the other one ran away. It's starting to sound like a country song. The cat came back eventually. About a year into my studies, my dear friend Marcia was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. I put everything that I could on hold so that I could be her full-time caregiver, and it truly, truly was an honor to be by her side in the year that she fought her cancer. Words cannot capture the beauty and the pain, the honor and the sorrow of being chosen to be by her side. I learned so much from her life and from her death. She passed away at home quietly, surrounded by people who loved her, like a little bird flitting off into the heavens. I grieved, and I studied, and I healed, and I grew. I meditated and journaled. I walked in nature with my yappy little mutt. I learned as much as I could about helping others heal while trying to heal myself. I went back to work. I started dating again. I continued seeing a therapist, but not as frequently. I published a collection of poems about my experiences with abusive relationships, words beyond words. I received regular massage therapy and acupuncture. And eventually, I stopped seeing my therapist altogether. I was doing well on my own. Near the end of my 5 years in school, I went to a Halloween party in Chicago. My friend and I were violently mugged by 3 men in clown masks on the way back to our car. My friend was struck in the skull with a crowbar and ended up being rushed into emergency surgery. I slept with my lights on for months. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see those distorted rubber masks haunting, following me, and leering at me. Thankfully, this beautiful community of Kenosha rose up and held me. This town is full of so many wonderful people. And they offered me safety and support. I went back into therapy, this time with someone who specialized in trauma. By now, I also had years of experience in facing my own trauma, and although I was deeply shaken, I did not fall. I completed grad school with a bachelor's in nutrition and a master's in oriental medicine. I've continued learning, adding additional education and training and certifications in working with people with post-traumatic stress disorder, natural functional medicine, and healing from trauma, amongst many other things. I'm one of those nerds that never stops learning. I've learned about the power of breath and the importance of being present. I've jumped headfirst into practicing this beautiful medicine called acupuncture, and I'm still studying and learning as much as I can. I've also been taking amazing personal and professional training and development classes through a company called Landmark Worldwide, and they've been phenomenal for me. I still have flashbacks occasionally, but those flashbacks no longer take me down. They no longer grip me in the way that they used to. And I'm able to recognize that what I'm feeling is not actually what's going on right now. After years of trial by fire and self-exploration, I have a much better understanding of how PTSD has impacted my life and the lives of the people around me. Last year, I created this event, PTSD Healing Connections, to start a different kind of conversation about post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is generally misunderstood, and as I said earlier, so often we think military veterans, and many times we don't know to seek out care after trauma because we don't fall under that category. What we don't realize is that anyone who experiences or witnesses a terrifying or a traumatic event can suffer from a lasting impact. There are more than 3 million cases, 3 million new cases of PTSD diagnosed every single year. PTSD can be triggered by military service, absolutely, and especially combat, but non-combat vets can experience PTSD as well. Other types of triggering events may include physical or sexual assault, childhood abuse or trauma, death of a loved one, violent attack, car accident, medical surgery, natural disaster, or a national attack. People working in high-risk professions with constant exposure to dangerous situations or life-threatening situations, such as members of the police force, the fire department, nurses, doctors, caregivers, or emergency responders. Symptoms of PTSD may last months or years, with triggers that can bring back memories of the trauma, accompanied by intense emotional and physical reactions. Telling someone to just get over it is not going to do them any good. Symptoms may include having nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance of situations that bring back memories of the trauma, heightened reactivity to stimuli, a hypervigilance, so you're like hyper aware of your surroundings, or a depressed mood, anxiety as well. If you've had PTSD in the past, you're more likely to be re-traumatized when exposed to a traumatic event. It is important to note that PTSD is a serious medical condition, which requires the appropriate diagnosis and the appropriate care. And in addition to working to a psychologist, a psychotherapist, or a counselor, there are many, many other measures that you can take to facilitate your healing. In my practice, Acupuncture and Wellness of Wisconsin, I still work with people who are dealing from traumatic experiences and living every day with stress or anxiety-related disorders, or everyday stress and anxiety. I've developed comprehensive treatment plans to support my patients in their healing that works in conjunction with their other medical plan that they have in place. Every day, I am grateful for the experiences which I have had, which have blessed me with a deeper sense of empathy and understanding for my patients. Every day, I am amazed by the healing potential of this human body. And every day, I am in awe of the strength and the courage of my patients. In my personal journey in healing from PTSD, I've incorporated many different techniques that have been deeply beneficial. Massage therapy, acupuncture, breath work, journaling, connecting with nature, playing and listening to music, creating art, gardening, healthful eating, fostering relationships with my family and my friends and my community. And yes, even that high-strung little yappy mutt and my giant, obese 25-pound cat. They have all been very powerfully healing for me. Breaking the silence and finding the courage to speak openly about my experiences and to share them with others has brought me more peace than I could have imagined. Today's speakers, as well as the business owners, the service providers, and the professionals who are here today, have many resources available for you. I encourage you to stay as long as possible to hear about the different perspectives they have to share. I'm so grateful for all of you being here today, whether you're here to learn, here to support someone, or you're here to provide information. Thank you to everyone who's joining us. My journey of self-healing and guiding others in their healing started back when I was 19, when I was in that abusive relationship. The man who introduced so much chaos into my life is the person who gave me the key to my healing. He asked me if I had ever considered massage therapy as a career. It had never crossed my mind before that. And massage therapy was the key that opened the door to my life's calling. I have to wonder if I would be here today, knowing what I know, had I never been involved with him. PTSD. It's 4 letters that mean so much. It is my personal journey with post-traumatic stress disorder that has guided me to this place, to this point. I am here today, standing in front of you because of the layers of trauma that I have lived through and grown through. I'm here today to share my story with you. And I hope that my story can help somehow. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so it's now my great honor to introduce Dan Medlock, who is our next speaker. And I'm going to just read his introduction because I didn't memorize it. So, Dan retired from the Navy after 26 years of active service, transitioned into the pharmaceutical industry where he worked as a neuroscience specialty representative until his interest was drawn back to his true passion in clinical psychology. He completed a master's degree in clinical psychology at Cardinal Stritch University, retired from pharma, and became I don't know what these letters mean. A bunch of letters. Nurse, licensed nurse. He'll tell you more about himself. And then he was working with the underserved population in Milwaukee's South Side at Renew Counseling Service. While at Renew Counseling, the medical director asked Dan to think about moving into the nursing profession to become a psychiatric nurse practitioner so he could help him with his growing workload. Dan entered Rush University Medical Center College of Nursing, graduating in 2015 with a master's. There are a bunch of letters in here. I should have pre-read this. I apologize. He continued on at Rush, where he's currently within a year of graduating with a Doctor of Nursing practice in psychiatry. Dan is a trained EMDR and heart map therapist, as well as a Reiki master who works with a great deal of trauma-related disorders as a part of working in general psychotherapy with children, adolescents, and adults. He also works as a part-time inpatient psychiatric nurse at Aurora Psychiatric Hospital in Milwaukee and at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago with the chronically mentally ill. In 2017, Dan began working with the local volunteer first responders in Kenosha County as part of his doctoral project. Dan completed his National Registry for Emergency Medical Technician Basic, and he's pursuing a paramedic certification to better align himself with the needs of the local first responders. The study group Dan works with is developing a traumatic stress surveillance program using the Sprint PTSD assessment tool, a mental resilience training program using HeartMath technologies, and establishing a peer-driven resource group of tenured firefighters, paramedics, EMTs in collaboration with Dry Hooch Veterans Organization, who is a well-established peer resource training group. And it is with that I will invite Dan to come and join us. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, you guys got me wired in. This is cool. Yeah. He's not going too far. Is this better? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick. Ben Kessel, he's physician's assistant. He's also the assistant medical director for the county for EMS. Kristen Struther, she works at, she's a Milwaukee the tier team, but she also works at Aurora Psych. James LaCar, he's a battalion chief out at Salem Lakes, and myself kind of formed a group to kind of get this thing kicked off. All right, so we looked at 3 pillars. We looked at what are we going to do? We want to increase the performance of the first responder, the volunteer first responders specifically. So we looked at the fire and EMS, and we're looking strictly at the volunteer first responders this time. So in order to build this, we looked at 3 pillars, literally: surveillance, resilience, and self-care. We built it on the idea of leadership. So I'm a Navy veteran, and what's familiar to me is the Navy, so we went back to that model. Go ahead. So why do we do this? Because these guys go in harm's way. All the time, they're going in harm's way all night long. And I rode with them a couple times, and I tell you what, it's hard work, and they see some things that is just unbelievable, that you haven't, I mean, just incredible. They get up the next morning and go to work. These are volunteers. So they will go out and they'll ride at night. Sometimes they ride during the day, the weekends, when we're just doing our regular thing, and you depend on them to save your lives. Go ahead. So what does this mean? Going in harm's way. So first responders face emotionally stressful work conditions. 60 to 90% of them will face a situation where they have multiple casualties. That's a guarantee. That's almost a guarantee. Almost 84% of them will find that they'll have to face the death of a child at some time in their career. This just happened recently with one of the guys I know. 84% of them, up to 84%, have a person die in their care. That happens quite a bit, actually. And then 55% will witness a violence act. In other words, it could be on them, or it could be on somebody else. Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry. All right, so about 81% of the emergency responders in Wisconsin, or that's what we are. We have volunteer responders. 81% of the coverage of Wisconsin. It's a high number. But this runs about 70, little over, almost 75% across the nation. And an interesting little fact was Ben Franklin, who actually got this whole thing kicked off. It was kind of neat, did the volunteer fire service. 11 to 32%, these numbers range for post-traumatic stress disorder in volunteer first responders. It averages about 22%, and that's kind of what we're seeing out in the community right now. And the paramedics have the highest levels of PTSD. They also have the highest level of suicide rate. Okay. So the pathway to pathophysiology, or if you want to get into this as far as the mind's concerned, you get traumatic stress, you feel overwhelmed. From there, your body just reacts to it. We've all had the same thing. We call it the SAM system. It's the sympathetic adrenal medullary system. So we get what we call catecholamines, dopamine, norepinephrine. These things are released into the body. We have the HPA axis, which is a little bit of a slower response, which we have chronic stress, and that's where we start really kind of feeling kind of down and stuff, right? Then ASD, which is called acute stress disorder, is less than 30 days, and post-traumatic stress disorder is greater than 30 days. So, and then we kind of see things kind of slow down. We see substance abuse, we see depression, and then we see suicidality. Go ahead, sorry. So what is PTSD? Lori did a great job. So we'll just kind of skip through this pretty quickly. I'm just going to cover 4 main areas: intrusive thoughts, avoidance, negative alterations in cognitions and mood, and alterations in arousal reactivity. And where I'm getting this from is the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 is a diagnostic and statistical manual put out by the American Psychiatric Association, and that's how we make diagnoses, okay? So where are some of the risks that PTSD, where does this all start from? Go ahead. So a lot of it, we're finding that people bring it to the job with them. There's a study done, it was started down in Southern California, actually it started with Kaiser Permanente years ago, and they started looking at trauma in children. And what they found out was that there's a high level trauma in the United States. High level trauma. And we're finding, like Laura said, a lot of this is, it's cumulative. So we're seeing people come into these services, the rescue and fire, rescue and things like this, that are exposed to trauma, and even in training, they'll start showing symptoms of PTSD. And I've seen that actually in the training. It was kind of interesting. We had people in class that maybe been on 1 or 2 runs and they're already starting to see symptoms. So the more you're exposed to trauma, the more stress that you're exposed to, the more cumulative and the lower the threshold. Go ahead. What's this going to cause? This is going to cause early death. The more trauma you're exposed in life, it will follow you through life. There's a Whitehall study in England, it just mimics this also, found the same thing, exact same thing. The more exposure to trauma over and over again, it limits you on your health, it limits you on a lot of different things. You'll smoke earlier in life, you'll drink earlier in life, you'll have a lot of problems. So this is typically what it is. So adverse childhood experience. So what are the things we bring home? So these firefighters and paramedics, they bring things like compassion fatigue home. So they just get plumb wore out. They really do. They really get wore out from just going out night after night trying to be kind. The people they're seeing are people that they're so vulnerable, they cannot help themselves. And what I mean by that, they're near death. And you think about that. So these young guys, it's kind of interesting, young guys and girls, 25, 26 years old, are intubating people. And if you did that in the hospital, it would take a medical doctor with a team to do that. They're doing it on the street. They're giving you roconium, or they're giving you ketamine, things that are powerful drugs, hugely powerful drugs. They're like 20, 25 years old. I was just stunned. Burnout syndrome. You do it long enough, you're going to get exhausted. You're going to get really exhausted. And then what we call in the Navy is operation tempo. So the operation tempo is this thing is, in the Navy, if you keep going back into a mission over and over again, right? You keep going back over and over again. At some point, something's going to break. It's either your equipment or the person, right? So how many revolutions you put on this thing? We call that op tempo. So they actually watch this in the military. If you have a hot tempo, they take you out of the field at some time. Go ahead. All right, so what are the risk factors job-related? The lack of control and unpredictability. And I'm going to come back to these in a minute because we're basing everything on. Am I going too fast, guys? Because I'll go fast. Limited training and material resources, the can-do spirit. We in the Navy call that the can-do spirit. And literally what that means is we'll get it done no matter what. Well, people get killed doing the can-do spirit. If we don't have enough equipment, you don't train these guys, they're answering calls along with the regular career fire departments. So there's a thing called the MABUS system out of Illinois. So you might end up on an engine one night that gets called into to take over for a regular fire department. And if you don't have the equipment and the training, they don't see any difference in that. So you got to be very careful. And the other one is competency and camaraderie. And this is something that was looked at after 9/11. They found that people, first responders who weren't a part of a group during 9/11 actually had higher levels of PTSD. And the reason why, they weren't a part of that unified group. Okay. Man-made disasters. This is something that's really, well, we see it now in the news. I'm just going to tell you right now. They saw it coming in 2015. It's here. This is not a question. It is here. This guy Wilson figured it out very quickly. And what they're finding out, these man-made, we call them man-made disasters. It's incredible. Unbelievable. But anyway, what they're finding is that first responders become overwhelmed very quickly. It's not like an accident on the highway. It's not like pulling somebody out of their house or a fire. You might have 4 or 5 casualties. You might have 100 casualties here. They might be of all different ages, so they just get overwhelmed very quickly. And so that multiple casualties, overwhelmed, disassociation. When you see disassociation, typically when up front with ASD, or acute stress syndrome, you're probably going to see PTSD down the road. Right? All right, so what do we look for? Well, this guy, Clem and Westpaw, what they got together, and they wanted to be predictive. They wanted to find out who gets PTSD. And where they found out there's traits. There's actually traits of the people in the volunteer fire service, right? They're younger in age. This is true. I'm telling you, I've seen it out here, right? They're usually single, right? They're injured during the exposure to a traumatic event. They have poor cognitive processing of the event. They just don't process it well. They lack social support, or they've encountered increased workload demands. Every one of these is what we're seeing right now. Every one of them. Go ahead. So the Wisconsin Legislative Council back in 2019 started to look at this sort of thing, and they're seeing it. They're seeing it. We're losing volunteer firefighters. 81% of our coverage is volunteer. We're losing EMS. They'll give you some idea of this. 87% of the calls for fire departments are not medical calls. Or they're medical calls, excuse me. They're not fire calls, they're medical calls. You think about that. How much does a fire engine cost? Anybody want to take a guess? $150,000. How about $1.5 million? Yeah. How many cycles are you going to put on that engine running out to somebody's house, right? So now they're getting SUVs. The Milwaukee Fire Department figured out, well, let's do this. Let's get a $20,000 or $25,000 SUV and run it out there instead of calling all the fire engines out, right? You break a fire engine, it's not a good thing, right? You break an SUV, we can replace it pretty quickly. So when you think about this, it's kind of interesting. They're doing more firefighting, or less firefighting, but they're more medical calls. They got to have training for medical calls. And here's another really crazy, cool thing that's happened. Really interesting thing. 3 states, California, Wisconsin, and Texas, are issuing bulletproof vests to first responders. Why is that? Because there's a need for it. I just heard Illinois is just now doing the same thing. So they're giving body armor to first responders because we're moving from a community-supported volunteer fire department to a medical department. Now we're moving to a civil defense department. And that's literally what we're getting, right? More of a civil defense, because these guys can respond to anything. So they're augmenting the fire and they're augmenting the police departments on their calls. Think about that. We've seen it in Las Vegas. You've seen teams of 3 go in to the site where they were having the shooting. It was the police, firemen, and paramedic. They were working in teams of 3. Okay, go ahead. All right, so warning signs of suicidality. PTSD is when it onsets, that's kind of kicks it off. Occupational dissatisfaction, stress and burnout, career transitions, right? Marital problems, and that happens a lot, guys. Sleep problems. Interesting about sleep problems. If you're hyper aroused all the time, you're not going to sleep well. If you're shaken out of a sleep in the middle of the night to answer an alarm, and if you ever who's been to a fire station or any place like that? They're amazing because I don't know, I can't tell the difference in the alarms. They all sound the same to me, right? These noises go off, and these guys, they'll let 4 or 5 minutes, all of a sudden they'll jump up, oh, that's ours. Like, how do you know? They all sound the same, but they do. So think about that. They've become so acute to understanding the difference in the sounds of alarms. It's all blur for me, okay? But hyperarousal, think about that. Wake a person out of sleep 4 or 5 times a night. They don't sleep the next day, right? It's really tough on them. Go ahead. All right, abasement and succurrence. Now this is kind of interesting. This is psychology of this guy. This is kind of interesting. This guy named Murray came up with these. These are needs. This comes out of Schneiderman's book for suicide, actually. So abasement is this sense, and I was really wanting to get an understanding of what drives these guys or girls out in the middle of the night to do these things. And why do they commit suicide, and why do they harm themselves, right? Part of it is abasement, which is the passive submission of an external force to escape blame, criticism, or punishment of self. If somebody dies on them, they keep that with them. It's their fault. They think in their mind it's their fault. They don't look at the stuff that happened before. They don't look at the pathology of the individual. In a hospital, I work in a hospital, I see the pathology. I can look at the medical record, I know what's going on long before something happens, right? They don't. Got to remember, they get woke up, you got a person on the side of the road, and they respond. And within that time, they have to make it a diagnosis, they have to treat. It is fast. It is a fast decision process. I kid you not. It is unbelievable. When I work in a hospital, we got residents, we got attendings, we got a whole staff we need, right? They don't. It's just them. 2 or 3 people. That's it, in the middle of the night. So if something goes wrong, they take that and internalize that, and they hold on to that. That amazes me. And that's what leads to this, succurrence, attachment. They have to be grouped together. Having somebody who loves you or nurtures you or helps you or a camaraderie, that's a very, very big point. And sometimes these guys become disenfranchised. When they become disenfranchised, that's when we start seeing problems. Right? So 7 years after the incident, this guy named paramedic George Reidner, right? He failed to revive a 2-year-old boy. His parents, interesting, the parents were both in the paramedic and fire service. My son was a classic case. I'm never going to tell anybody. If I tell them, they'll think I'm weak. So, like many of the first responders dedicated to save lives, Ryder was 27, never talked about his struggles. He committed suicide. 27 years old. Think about that. Committed suicide. And this is 7 years after this event. He held this thing for 7 years. It's amazing. I see it. So we started this project in 2017. I'm a therapist on the site, and I've already been called out 4 times just on the side to go talk to people they thought were going to commit suicide. Okay? It's pretty amazing. Go ahead. All right, what are the protective factors? This is what we're trying to work towards. Camaraderie, familial social support, organizational support, and a sense of purpose. You know, I was in the Navy. I mean, in the Navy, we have this thing called honor, courage, and commitment, which is the core values of the Navy. The Marine Corps shares the same thing, I think, right? We actually stole it from the Marine Corps. I had no problems. I knew exactly what it was. I knew my organization. I knew why I was there. I had a purpose, right? I knew everything. A little different in the volunteer service. These fire service and paramedic stuff is a little bit different thing. Go ahead. All right, so what we started was this idea. We come up with this, we based it on Clement Westphal, their recommendations. We did surveillance. And surveillance means we go out And we're sending this thing called the Sprint, and I'll show you to you in a second. It's a Sprint assessments, real quick. We look for symptomology. Could be PTSD, could be drinking, could be anything else at all. We're looking for this. Only 2 questions, real quick. We send it on a periodic basis. Collect that data. Resilience training. So the military came out with this. The Army was the first really that entered into the military resilience program. Is anybody familiar with what resilience training is? All right, we'll get to that in a second. Okay, and then self-care is the third pillar. So a lot of times you'll see a lot of people die in the fire and medical services because of their heart problems. Incredibly heart problems. What I wasn't aware of is that if you let those boots sit down there, or those the gear you give you, the stuff that you get contaminated with will kill you. A guy I was talking to, he was a former Marine, he was the captain of one of the departments. He used to throw his gear in the back after a fire. His 2 dogs died because they rode in the back of the car, they died of cancer. So they have these big washing machines, they wash their gear all the time. Got me afraid to bring my boots in. Go ahead. All right, so this is actually, we got permission from the guy who designed this. He's a physician over in North Carolina. He said, good, go ahead and use it. You guys are good cause, didn't charge us a cent. So this is huge. This is a well-designed study. It's called the Sprint Surveillance. You can get it on the Ptsd website of the VA. This is where we got it from. So he gave us permission. Go ahead. All right, so mental resilience training is the second pillar of this. And so this was the presentation we gave to the chiefs and captains, and we gave to some of the firefighters and paramedics, so it might be a little salty on this. But basically what we're looking for in the military is not that you get knocked down, it's that you can go through it and go through it, that you can keep getting back up over and over again. Because you're going to get knocked down regardless in life. That's it. You're going to experience trauma, you're going to experience things. We know that. That's something you just got to accept, right? We don't want you to get locked up in that. What we want to do is have you to come back again. And while you're in it, we want you to be able to work through it. So there's no bouncing back. This guy was a Navy SEAL, actually became the governor of Missouri, Greitens. He was a Navy SEAL and ended up being the governor of Missouri. There's only moving through this thing. You have to move through this process. Go ahead. All right, so the Navy Combat Operational Stress Center, we got a lot of the stuff that came from there. We looked at leadership. So leadership is really where it's coming from. And so we differed from the Army. The Army they have a huge program that comes from the University of Pennsylvania. It's a great program. But the Navy took a little bit different. The Navy says we're always in operational stress. Now, why is that? So the Army has these big units, they move them overseas, they come back and forth. The Navy's different. You go on a ship or an aircraft, Captain Rose is back here, he can tell you about this and stuff. You go on an aircraft, you're constantly in an operational area, and you're under stress, right? So you can leave your home and be in someplace, somebody else's backyard real quick. A little different. So we look at things different in the military, or the Navy. Go ahead. So we look at the leadership, and what we're looking for, again, predictability, controllability, relationships, trust, and meaning. These are the 5 core tenets that the leadership teaches and pushes down, and they want people to assimilate. We know it's going to be unpredictable. We know what's going to happen to you is going to be uncontrollable. We want you to work on your relationships, right? We want you to be able to trust, and we want you to find meaning in what you're doing. Right? All right, so 6 qualities of resilient people. This was a group that the government, actually the VA put together. It's Everly's group. And it says the Navy, they did a focus group. This was Navy SEALs. This is Navy SEALs. They went to the SEALs. They went to the FBI Special Operations Team. They went to all these different special operations groups. And they looked at it and they asked them, so what do you find? What is the 6 qualities you find most important to be resilient? Number 1 was optimism and faith. Straight up. Optimism and faith. Integrity. Social support. Decisiveness and responsibility. Perseverance and tenacity and self-control. Those are the 6 things that all these units agreed upon in that order. Think about that. Can we teach this back? And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to teach it back. We're trying to create this culture where this is actually happening. Go ahead. All right, so heart math training. So we're actually, because these guys, they like to put their hands on stuff, and we can sit up and talk, and it's great, but until you actually start processing and doing it, right? Who's in medical? Anybody done medical before? Firefighting, all that good stuff like that? You can talk about it and learn theory until you actually put your hand on it and do it. It doesn't mean anything. So we got them something to put their hand on. It's a little heart math monitor. We're trying to get more of these guys. If you want to, anybody knows wants to volunteer, put some money towards this, we'd be more than happy to do that. But this is a really cool thing because this is a heart rate regulation. It regulates your heart rate. So in other words, it creates emotional stability. So that's when you go into a combat situation. They use this in the military. They can put their thumb on it. Actually, Navy units are now using this sort of thing instead of getting drunk. Believe that when they come out. They try to calm themselves with this. And it works really well. I've got one. There's 3 different systems. There's a hand monitor. There's one you can clip on your ear. And there's another one that comes on the computer. And what you're going to find out is this is a system here. You see the top one? That's a system out of stress. Your heart's like this. It races, right? This is a system not as stressed, not as much. That's very low frequency. This is a decent system here. See how it's kind of leveled out like this? Every time you breathe in, your heart rate goes up. Every time you breathe out, your heart rate goes down. On the back side of that, you also flood your body full of like really cool chemicals like oxytocin, things like this. It helps you calm down and stuff. And when you think about that, if you do that regularly, you can get in what they call coherence. And kind of ooey-ooey on you guys, but red coherence means not good. Blue's okay, green is great level. And how they do this, if you really, give it to you real quick. Here's a lagniappe for you, as they say in Louisiana. Breathe in, just like Laura was doing. It's a 5-second cycle. They found that 5-second cycles, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. The Navy calls it box breathing, okay? They do a little bit of a 4. When you breathe in, 5 seconds, take your time, breathe from your belly, and blow out. And then shift, pretend like you're breathing through your heart. Let your heart just actually think you're blowing up your heart and exhaling through your heart. Try it. You'll be surprised what happens, okay? If you want to shift to the highest level, just think about how you help other people. And the people, I work with a bunch of nurses. I'm a nurse, right? The nurses are phenomenal at this. They're compassionate. And you don't know it, but when they start breathing, they can shift into that green state and they can stay in that green state long. It's hard to do when you're on the side of a road and you got semi trucks coming at you 90 miles an hour, or there's a fire going on, right? This is tough to do. You don't know what you're going to get into. You go into somebody's house, they're on the floor. I mean, you have no idea you don't know if there's a dog or somebody's going to shoot you or what. You don't know what's going on, right? This is what these guys are facing. Think about that 4 or 5 times a night, and you got to get up, see your family, and go back to work the next day. All right, go ahead. So creating a network, we're also doing this. This is kind of a really cool thing, and this has really worked out really well. So Jim Lacarge, actually, he's the battalion chief down in Salem Lakes over here, and they're an awesome department. I'm going to tell you, Salem Lakes is just awesome. Bristol's a fantastic department too. They're all good, but I know these guys stuff, right? But Jim is really taking this, and he's really ran with this. He really wants to set up this peer mentoring program. And he wants to get some of the senior like firefighters and paramedics together to really know these guys and help them out and stuff and talk to them. We don't want to let them go. We don't want these young guys to go and young girls to go because they get disenfranchised, we lose them, right? Same thing in the military. I was a senior chief in the Navy. That's one thing. Our job is to make sure people stay together, right? Keep them going. So Jim's got this thing going, and he started to develop this thing, and we went up and talked to this Bob Curry, Dry Hooch. Is anybody familiar with Dry Hooch? Dry Hooch is a Wisconsin-born thing. Bob Curry, if you want to look at what's Bob Curry's story, go to Experience Life magazine for January and February, and Bob Curry's featured in it. Bob Curry was a forward combat pilot in Vietnam, and when the first Gulf War went up, he got drunk, ran over and killed a guy. And so he went down, was going to go to jail, and he basically some things worked out. And when he was in jail, he realized he needed to do something with his life. And so he started the Dry Hooch. And the Dry Hooch is where you can go in, get a cup of coffee, right, and sit. And if you're a veteran, we got a lot of young veterans, tons of young veterans that won't go near the VA, right? Still not settled down yet. But they'll come in and get a cup of coffee and sit there. And they won't talk to them. They'll just sit there and let them come in. Maybe it takes 2 months. Maybe it takes 6 months. They don't know. They're there and they'll wait for them. They'll just wait for them. It's a neat, you've got World War II veterans, you've got Korea veterans, and you've got Vietnam veterans, you've got Gulf War veterans sitting in there. It's a neat place. And it's cool, it really is. If you want to go up, it's on Brady Street in Milwaukee. He's franchised this out. He's got a presidential award, franchised it out. It's all through the nation now. So Dry Hooch. What they want to do, Jim and him's working on, is Dry Hooch first responder. And Kenosha could be the first place for that. So you guys might be another first here. Okay? So we just need support with these guys. Go ahead. Jim's at training right now. Actually, Jim's in their training program right now today. That's why he's not here. So the roadmap to resilience in Kenosha County. I'm good on time, right? Yeah, right. Rolling. Roadmap to resilience in Kenosha County. So what is our roadmap? You guys are the community. We got to come up with this. If you want these guys to stay around, right, we got to support them. And I'm saying guys in general, but guys and girls. They're young. I'm telling you, they're young. It amazed me what they can do. I mean, 24, 25 years old. I mean, and they are sharp. We rode to different places. We actually ended up in another state. I will tell you, the guys I worked with, and it was unplanned, the people I worked with that night were 24, 23, 25. They were fantastic. I would trust my life with them. Go ahead. So where do we go from here? 4 steps. We need to get the word out about this movement. We need to tell people, hey, look, we got volunteer fire medical people, right? Now, if you live in the city, you've got a fantastic fire department, and you've got fantastic medical services. You go west of 94, and you're going to have to end up with a volunteer department. Okay, some of them are paid, most of them are volunteer, and they have to do the same thing that they have to do in Kenosha. Okay, cultural buy-in from the first responders. There's a culture there. They think differently, so they're really taught from the word go that it's, I mean, they don't go in there like a nurse. We're in the hospital. We see all this stuff. These guys take it really personally. I mean, some of these guys, you get to deliver babies. These guys, I mean, never delivered a baby before, and they have to deliver babies. It's amazing, And if something happens, they take responsibility. This is very serious medical care that these guys are doing, and they're very young, guys and girls, and they take it deeply, very deeply, to the point where they end up trying to commit suicide. Last thing is funding heart math. Well, we need some monitors. These departments went out and talked to them and said, we want this thing for $500. And they're like, well, yeah, it's either that or an air pack, Dan. Well, I can't argue with that. Well, okay, well, it's either that or we don't get new radios. We want to regulate the person. We want to regulate things. We could have the greatest number of fire department engines. We could have fire engines and air packs. But if you ain't got a person to go through that thing, we don't have anything. And we need to make sure these guys are taken care of, right? They get cancer, high rates of cancer, high rates of cardiovascular disease, high rates of cardiovascular disease. Stress is unbelievable. So you got to remember, you're putting all this equipment on, you're running through these buildings, it's hot, you're stressed out, it's tough. And the last thing is peer leadership, so the dry hooch ER. Go ahead. So this is to be continued. I have my name on another slide here and stuff. If you guys want to get a hold of me, and that was fast, I'm telling you. I went through 35 slides in 30 minutes. That's unheard of, right? All right, I was hooking. So to be continued. So what do we do? What's the next steps? What do you want to do? It's up to you guys. What do you want to do? I mean that sincerely. If you have any ideas, tell us. I'll put my email out there. Ben Kessel's phenomenal. Ben Kessel is absolutely phenomenal. Jim LaCar, unbelievable guy. These guys are sincere and they're very good at what they do, and they'll listen. So if you guys have some ideas, we can create this here. You can create it in Southeast Wisconsin. It'll be the first of its kind. Okay? Thank you guys. Okay.
My name is Aurelia Ortiz, and I am one of the outreach specialists for the Aging and Disability Resource Center of Kenosha County. And we're basically the one-stop shop for anybody who's 60 years old or older, any 18-year-old or older with a disability, as well as any family caregiver caring for any one of these two groups of people. We have an array of services, and like I said, we're a one-stop shop servicing the elderly, the disabled, and their family caregivers. We have benefit specialists in-house that are there willing to help you through the process of applying through the Medicare insurance. We have health and wellness classes that we offer. We have an ethnic elders group, and it's a community of elderly people who gather every month, and their mission is just to serve back and give back to the community with their service. Aside from that, we also have a protective services unit. We have transition services unit who help any children who are currently in the child services with a disability and who are getting ready to prepare to transition to the older adult services. So we're here in Kenosha County. All of our services are free of charge, and we welcome you to just walk in. You don't need an appointment. You can call us. Our telephone number is 262-605-6646, and please give us a call with any questions that you may have. We're here to serve you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Susan. I'm with American Telepsychiatry. We handle the medication side of mental health disorders. We go through telecommunications, so as Skyping your providers and your doctors. And we have clinics all over Wisconsin, and we're opening up some in Illinois. So moving forward, we handle the medication side of all health and mental illnesses. The phone number would be 414-376-6053.
Hi, I'm Dr. Abrams. Thank you very much for having me here. This afternoon, we're going to talk about trauma-informed care. And the reason that I talk about trauma is because it affects everybody in every way. We used to start talking about trauma because of the military, and we used to just talk about it exclusively as a military problem. But one of the things that we've realized is that trauma occurs in our lives just by virtue of our experiences, what we go through, where we live, who we know, and what's around us. So trauma is something that we're all exposed to and something that we all have been impacted by either personally or with our families. So when we all get up in the morning and we get dressed and we get ready to go out, whether we're going to work or whether we're just going to the grocery store or whatever it is that we're doing, when we get up and we go to see somebody and they say, "Hi, how are you?" What do you generally say?
Fine.
Right, you say, "Fine, I'm fine. How are you?" And you smile, and you don't really tell everybody what is the backstory, because when somebody says, "Hi, how are you?" they're not really asking to sit down and hear the rest of your life story, right? But the truth is that, what is your name?
L.
Al. Do you know that before Al got here, we're really close, I just found out his name. So Al, before he got here, his rose bush died, his favorite rose bush. His refrigerator kicked out and his puppy ran away. But you know what? When I said, "Hey, how are you doing, Al?" he said, "Fine, how are you?" And that's one of the problems with trauma, is that we don't know each other's backstory. We just see the presentation that happens when we interact with somebody. And they usually say, "Fine, how are you?" How many of us would treat somebody differently if we knew that their puppy ran away and their refrigerator died and they lost their rose bush? Most of us would say, "Wow, I have to really be nice to Al today because all of these things have happened and he's really struggling right now." So that is something that we need to keep in mind when we meet people and when we interact with people, because we don't know what's going on in their head. Not everybody has that little speech bubble on top of them that says what is going on in their lives. And so sometimes we may not understand someone's reaction, we might not understand their interaction, and we might not understand what exactly is happening with them. So we're going to take a look at this video, and while you're watching this video, I want you to be thinking about what I said, which is, would you treat someone differently if you knew their history or if you knew what was going on? That is really what trauma-informed care is about. It's another way of communicating with people when we find out what is going on with them. And even when we don't know, it's not always going to show on someone's face. You don't look at someone and know they have a mental illness. You don't look at someone and know that they're suffering inside. So what we have to do is have a new way of communicating with people that takes care of that because we're not going to know. And what I like to think of it as universal precautions for communication. We have universal precautions for medical care, right? If there's a blood spill, there are certain steps everyone needs to take. If someone has the flu, there are steps everybody needs to take. You have to wash your hands. You should count to the alphabet, wash with hot water, use soap. There are things that we know how to do physically, which teach us how to take care of a physical problem. Well, there are communication skills that we need to learn that teach us how to deal with trauma, whether it's on us because we look distressed, or it's not on us and we don't know. Go ahead. Labels stick. The thing with trauma and the thing with mental health and mental illness is that we don't always know why someone's acting the way they are or behaving the way they are or why they're doing what they do. And so sometimes what I hear, and I'm sure what you hear, is that they're just attention seeking. They're just being a jerk. They're just acting out. They're just trying to not deal with what they have to deal with. They're trying to get out of something, right? There's all kinds of things. When I first started as a psychologist, my very, very first patient, and I thought I knew everything because I was 22, and I knew nothing. So my very first patient was a 12-year-old girl who I tried to impart all of my worldly wisdom onto, to which she responded to me, "I don't really think I need to listen to you." And she used very colorful words, but needless to say, she called me a drug-addicted woman of the streets. And I knew that that probably wasn't true, because I would have known if that was true. But that label, I remember her calling me that to this day. To this day, right? And I am sure that if we think about in our past, there's somebody who called us lazy or stupid or worthless or whatever it was, and you remember that because it has an impact, because labels stick. So we have to be very careful about what we say to each other and how we talk to each other, because years down the road, even when we know it wasn't true, because I have never walked the streets for money, I remember that. I remember it. So how bad is it really? You know, we hear all the time, well, there's all these statistics out there. The truth is that 1 in 4 women, and I think it says 1 in 6 males, but I don't actually know how accurate that is, because I work in a prison, and I would say it's probably 8 in 10 males who have been sexually abused. So if you're sitting in that seat and you're saying, well, that's not me, then you need to look around the room, because it's somebody in here. And it's somebody you know. And it's your mother, your brother, your sister, your father, your cousin. It is somebody you know, because we don't have those kind of numbers without it being somebody we know. 70% of the general adult population, that's us, right? We are 70% of the population has had at least one traumatic event, and 80% of women seeking treatment have had some kind of physical or sexual abuse. So it is you, it is me, it is our family, it is our community, and it is our neighborhood. So what is a traumatic event? This is always kind of tricky because it's really very individual. And that's hard for people to understand, because what might be traumatic to me may not be traumatic to Al, who's now wishing he sat in the back of the room and didn't tell me his name.
I had a 7th grade nun that used to call me Judas. She said they call you Judas because you carry with your behavior.
All right. So traumatic events really depend on what has happened to you, what your experience has been. Because people who have gone through life relatively unscathed, or have had just events in their life that maybe haven't been so good, but they felt like they could deal with them, they might not have had experienced trauma until they're older, and they have more coping skills. And so what might be traumatic to many people doesn't really seem to impact them that much. Trauma's not the event, right? If I was in a car accident and it was a fender bender and nobody got hurt, but I had to take my car to the mechanic, and then maybe I had to rent a car to get to work, and it was an inconvenience, but it wouldn't necessarily be traumatic to me. But if it was somebody else who had the same accident, and it was a fender bender and nobody got hurt, but that car was their home, it would be a whole lot more traumatic to them. So it really depends on who you are, what your experiences have been, and what level of coping you have amassed in your life up until this point. Trauma is absolutely not the event. It is our experience of the event, which is why it is different for everyone. Trauma itself, really, that word just means that we are incapable of dealing with the experience. It is above our coping skills. It is above our frustration tolerance. We don't have the ability to figure out what to do. We feel overwhelmed. Trauma is always negative. It brings up feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. We can feel real paralyzed by it. We don't know how we are going to move past whatever it is that's happened to us. We get stuck. So if you think in your own lives, have you ever had the experience where you keep repeating the same behavior over and over again, even though it didn't work for you the last time, but you find yourself, you just did it again, and it didn't work for you this time either, and you're like, why am I doing that? Why do I keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? That's about trauma. Because when we get triggered to an event, to an experience, and we re-experience those emotions, and we get overwhelmed, and we start feeling negative, and we start feeling helpless and hopeless, we go back to the behavior that we did when that event happened, even if it didn't work for us. So, for example, I work in a prison, and I would like to say that I never see the same people over and over again, but it's not true. Sometimes I see the same people many times over and over again. And one of the first things that some of the officers and some of the people in the intake area say is, what are you doing? You're back again? What are you doing back again? When you left the last time, you said, I'm never coming back here. I've learned my lesson. I've got this. I'm not going to do it again. Well, one of the things that happens is that when we get into a situation where we don't know how to cope and we don't know how to deal with it and we don't know what to do, we go back to old behaviors. And that is part of trauma. So trauma can result from childhood, sexual, physical abuse, from neglect, abandonment, rape, sex trafficking, domestic violence, just witnessing or experiencing a crime, catastrophic illness or injury, war, terrorism. I thought it was really interesting. The other day, my daughter came home from school, and her teacher told her to ask her parents or her grandparents one question. She was in American history. And she said to me, what was it like to live in the United States when we weren't at war? And I said, what? She said, what was it like to live in the United States before we were at war? And I realized that she has never lived her entire life at a time when we weren't deploying people and we weren't at war. She does not know what peacetime is. She has never seen an airport without TSA. She does not have any understanding of what the world was like before 9/11. She wasn't born. So I found that to be fascinating. I also found that to be highly traumatizing for me to realize how incredibly old I am and how incredibly young she is. There's community or school violence and bullying, right? Cultural dislocation. We have all those people who were involved in the hurricanes. They had Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Isabel that, just trashed large portions of the United States. And so there were lots of people who had to start all over and got relocated. Historical or generational violence, natural disasters, racism, poverty. That's a really big thing in our area. And misuse of power. We have people who are in authority and they don't always use their authority well. With absolute power comes absolute responsibility, and some people aren't responsible in how they treat others. So what do we know about trauma? Here's something that we do know. The brain keeps developing from when we're in utero until the age of 25. It keeps growing and developing, and new connections are made, and all kinds of stuff continues to happen until we're about 25 years old, and then our brain stops physically growing. Every time that we have a trauma, it impacts our brain. This front part of our brain, which is the frontal cortex, this part of our brain gets flatter. It doesn't grow as much. And some of the connections, they stop. So when we have a fairly average brain, you can see that during any normal situation, lots of different parts of our brain light up, and they activate with each other. There's all kinds of colors. There's all kinds of things going on. That counts for activity. But when there's trauma, those connections break. So this is a brain that had some, not right. Okay, this is a brain that had some abuse. And where before, in a brain without so much abuse, there's all this activity. In the brain where there was abuse, it's dark. Those synapses, those things, they stop working. They break apart, and for every time there's a trauma, there's more and more and more deactivation. Does it grow back? No. No. Trauma has a profound and permanent impact in our brain. Can we do something about it? Yes. Because what we can do is learn new ways of dealing with things and new ways of coping, but it takes a lot more work after your brain has been changed by incidents of trauma. So trauma is really, it's comprised of three things. It's the event, right? What is it that exactly happened? Was somebody in a car accident? Were they in a hurricane? Were they assaulted? What happened? So the event itself is trauma. Who were you at the time of the event? Were you a child? Were you a teenager? Were you an adult? Were you at work? Was it your husband, your wife? And what was the social climate at the time of the event? And we are seeing how that really is playing out right now with the Me Too movement, right? When it first started, it was started with these actresses in Hollywood who came out speaking against There's producers and directors who they felt sexually assaulted or sexually harassed them. For many of them, this happened years and years ago. And when it did happen, they were told, suck it up and move on if you want a job. If you want a career, you're going to be quiet. You're not going to tell your story. You are just going to accept that this is the price that you have to pay for this kind of a job, and you move forward. So the climate at the time these events happened played a huge part in how they dealt with their trauma and what they did with what happened to them. Now the social climate is different. Now, when people are saying, me too, sometimes people are losing their jobs. Sometimes people are being punished. There's people who have to go to classes. They have to be more sensitive to what's going on and how their speech and their actions impact other people. So it's not just the event and who you are, it's also what surrounds you. Because a person who tells their story and is believed and is supported has a very different experience than somebody who's told, suck it up and move on. This is the price that you pay. So I have a really quick group experiment for you. Just raise your hand. How many of you remember where you were when 9/11 happened? I would say that's probably everybody, right? Just shout it out for a minute. Why do you think that you remember where you were when 9/11 happened? Why did it have such an impact on you?
Because it was a tragedy.
It was a tragedy. Yeah? The media coverage. The media coverage, right? When 9/11 happened, I think that was the start of the 24-hour cable cycle where we just saw that all the time. Why else do you think that you remember where you were when 9/11 happened? It was scary. It was really scary. We were at home. These were people who were at work, just going to work on a normal day that we could relate to. They got up, they got dressed, they left their house, they went to work, and they died out of nowhere. So it was an incredibly scary thing for all of us. How many of you know where you were when Katrina happened? Not everybody. Some interesting facts about Katrina. More people died from Katrina than from 9/11. It was also on our homeland. The people that were there saw bodies floating down the street by them. It was their neighbors. It was their kids. They were without water. They were without food. They were on the rooftop of their homes. Why do you think you don't know where you were when Katrina happened, which was in 2005?
It was an act of the weather. It wasn't a terrorist. It wasn't going to create a war.
Right. She said it was an act of terror. It wasn't an act of terror. It was an act of the weather. So it didn't seem as scary, maybe. So random. At some point, the American Psychological Association and the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association went to the TV stations and they said, you need to stop playing video of the planes going into the towers. It is causing mental health crisis across the country. It raised our anxiety level, it raised our depression level, and it caused a lot more national panic by their continual play of that particular incident. So there's a difference between an acute trauma, which is something that generally happens as we get older, and it's generally a one and done kind of thing. There's acute trauma, and then there's complex trauma. Complex trauma tends to happen when we're younger. It's ongoing, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, those kinds of things. Living in a household where someone is a substance abuser. things that are more chronic, and they're also highly stigmatizing. If you had a car accident, I don't think many of you would feel all that hesitant to go into work the next day and say, oh my gosh, I had such a bad day yesterday. I was in a car accident. You know, it was my fault or it wasn't my fault, whatever the case may be, and you probably would be willing to tell your coworkers that. But how many of you would be willing to go into work and say, you know what, I'm having a really difficult time because I was sexually abused as a child? Not many people, even though that's also not your fault. But there's a highly stigmatizing message to abuse and to chronic trauma, so people don't feel comfortable talking about it. People look at you differently when you talk about that kind of trauma. So what are the symptoms of complex trauma? What does it look like? It looks like somebody who has difficulty managing their emotions. It has a lot of anxiety. It has an increased level of depression, low frustration tolerance. Do you ever see people that go from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds and you don't even know why it happened? You're like, what just happened here? I didn't really do anything. They have difficulty expressing their needs, thoughts, and concerns using words. They have difficulty understanding what's being said. Difficulty doing things in a logical sequence. Do you ever see people who they start to do something and they go from A to Q to Z and then they're like, how did I do this? I forgot that. And they have to start all over again. That's just me because I'm old, but other people, it's because of trauma. They have difficulty maintaining focus, right? You're talking to someone and they have a really hard time following you. They start to drift. And then you say something, you bring them back, and they start to drift. It's not always because you're boring. That's just me again. We're talking about me a lot today. And they have difficulty finishing things in a certain time frame. They have difficulty staying on task and finishing things. When you say, you have an hour to get this done, they're 45 minutes in and you're like, you're on the first page. That doesn't seem to work. Social difficulties. Thank you. So for some people, when they have been traumatized, it's hard for them to assess social cues. What does that mean exactly? Well, if somebody is hurting you and saying, I love you, it's hard for you to wrap your head around that and really understand that. So if you've been abused and you've had this chronic trauma by someone, say, who was your caretaker, and they're saying, I love you, you're my favorite, I love you so much, you're the best, while they're hurting you, the next time someone says, I really like you, you're going to go, right? So you're not going to understand social cues and social interactions in the same way. You're going to have a hard time connecting with others because when trust is broken early and it's not repaired in a healthy way, in a reasonable time frame, your ability to trust others, which is generally the basis for most relationships, is impaired, right? You're not going to know exactly what to do. Someone's doing the right thing and you kind of go, why are you doing that? You have ulterior motives. And that offends people. You would not believe when someone tries to do something nice and you look at them and go, they take that the wrong way. And we don't always appreciate how our behavior impacts other people. So I might be really irritable because I am in a situation where I got triggered by something and I'm kind of irritable and everyone else is trying to have a good time and I'm sitting in the corner just irritable as all get out. I am ruining their experience and I don't understand why they can't just get over themselves and understand that I'm having a difficult time. People who've experienced a lot of trauma tend to be more impulsive. They don't know how to handle change very well. They do better in structure and routine. So when things just happen, they're not always good with handling things that just happen. And they have a hard time with unpredictability. So what might you see? People who experience a lot of trauma tend to be much more hypervigilant. What does that mean? People are on their toes, looking around all the time. I want to know who is where and what they're doing and when they're moving, and nobody is going to get close to me unless I say it's okay. When I go out in public, I can always tell who are the first responders, who are the police, who are the correctional officers, because do you know where they are? Besides in a bar, do you know where they are? They're in the corner. They're in the corner. And they know where all the entrances and exits are, they know where all the windows are, and they don't let anyone walk up on them. Right? They have a larger personal space bubble than most people. I always find it so amazing how most people in the world interact. Would you be willing to do that little exercise with me? Come on, you can do it. I always like to volunteer people. Okay, if you just go stand by the music stand. So I always think this is a really fascinating thing, because I've worked in corrections for a really long time. So when I tell you I want you to walk towards me, and I am going to tell you when to stop when I feel comfortable with you having a conversation with me, okay? All right, so you can walk towards me. Stop. That's my personal space, because I work in a prison. I've worked in a prison for a really long time. I've worked in maximum, medium, minimum, and community corrections. And I don't want people too close to me who I don't know. He's probably a really nice guy, but I don't know him, so he can stand right there. Do put out your hands. This is how far apart I generally have conversations with people who I don't really know all that well. Now I'm going to show you something that really freaks me out. Can I walk closer to you? You can do it. I won't hurt you. Most people in the world talk here. You moved. You were police officer. I could tell. Most people in the world, this is where they talk. Totally freaks me out. Good. Thank you. I don't understand that. My brothers are like, whoa, they come up, they talk to me, I start walking backwards. They're like, no, it's okay, it's just me. I'm like, I know, you stand right there. A lot of people who experience a lot of trauma, they get real numb. They don't feel anything, because feeling things is too intense. It is too overwhelming, it's too hurtful, and it's too negative. And so the way to deal with a lot of situations in the world is to just numb out. I don't want to feel anything. Either that, or when they do feel, they go from 0 to 60 really, really fast. And they're not even always aware that they're doing it. I can be talking to somebody at work, and they're fine, and the next thing I know, they're standing up and they have their fists like this, and I'm like, well, nothing happened. Nothing happened. But they were triggered by something in our conversation. We have to remember that what we see is only the tip of the iceberg. There is always so much more going on underneath, particularly when someone has had a traumatic experience. So based on that, I try and teach people to use what I call universal precautions in communication. So what does that mean? That means instead of asking someone, what's wrong with you? Why did you do that? Which makes people defensive and they want to just be quiet and say, go away. You say, what's happening right now? So that I can give somebody an opportunity to tell me what's going on. To say to me, I feel really uncomfortable, or now I feel really angry, or I feel really upset. They can have the opportunity to speak out. Because when we allow people to speak in their own voice and speak in their own way, we give them the freedom to be able to experience their emotions, experience the situation, and have a different outcome. We always want to focus on safety and autonomy. We want to let people be who they are while allowing them to be safe, while allowing them to process situations differently. Because if I have the same behavior but I have a different outcome, I might try it a little differently the next time. So there was this study by Kaiser where they took 17,000 people, right? So they took everybody who was going into their medical appointments, whether it was the pediatrician or the cardiologist or whatever it was. Didn't matter what kind of doctor it was. They just stopped 17,000 people on their way into doctor's appointments, and they said, will you fill out this survey for me? Don't put your name on it. Don't put anything on it. I don't want to know any of that personal information. I just want to know randomly, if you've experienced these things. So they asked what became this childhood adverse experiences checklist. So they asked people, have you ever been involved in childhood abuse, verbal, physical, sexual, neglect, emotional? Have you grown up in a dysfunctional household where there was a divorce or there was substance abuse? Did you witness domestic violence? Was there anybody who was mentally ill or suicidal in your household? Did you experience any crime? So out of these 17,000 random people, 63% had experienced at least one of those events. That means most of us in this room, because we comprise that same kind of population as those 17,000 people. So 63% of us in this room have experienced at least one of those traumas. And 20% of us have experienced at least 3 of them. If you think about your life, your workplace, your family, your social interactions, do you know somebody who absolutely went through life without any adverse childhood experiences? Because I think it's getting more and more rare. So the more of these adverse childhood experiences that you have, the more difficult your life generally is. There are higher risk factors for alcoholism, for drug use, for domestic violence, for divorce, for crime, for smoking, for depression, suicide attempts, heart disease, liver disease, and obesity. The more of those experiences that we've had, the more self-destructive we are. And the more of these experiences that we've had, and we don't deal with them, the more disrupted our brain development, so that's what it means by neurodevelopment, the more social, emotional, and cognitive problems we have, which leads all the way up to early death. Whether that be from suicide, whether that be from heart disease, doesn't really matter. The more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more trauma that you've had in your life when you're younger that you don't work on and deal with, the greater your chance is for early death. So what are some of the potential triggers for our trauma? Well, if we experience something that takes us back to a traumatic experience, we tend to feel more hopeless and helpless. We feel powerless. Sometimes we act with force. We make people get out of our way. We run out of situations. Things like isolation, things like physical restraints. When somebody grabs you or hugs you or touches you when you don't want to be, can be a trigger. Interacting with authority. Some people have a lot of trouble with authority if the authority is the one that hurt them. Lack of privacy. These are all things that being watched, being touched, loud noises, being in darkness, these are all things that could be triggers. Things that are reminders of past events. This is really one of the hallmarks of how we came to learn about PTSD, is that there were smells and sounds and touches and things that reminded people of those past events. And for those people who were in the armed services, a lot of those had to do with their deployment. But for those of us who are hurt in our homes, it could be the smell of baking bread. It could be the smell of burning wood. It can be anything around us. It can be loud noises. For those children in Florida, in Parkland, Florida, it's going to be the sound of gunshots. Those are the things that can trigger us. When we feel a separation or loss, when we feel vulnerable, when we feel rejected, these are all the things that take us back into our past and make us feel uncomfortable and can trigger those same behaviors. So what do we do? What do we do? We have to be able to do something. Well, the first step is just understanding that not everybody around us is trying to hurt us. And that sounds really simple, but if you've experienced complex trauma and that's part of your life, you don't know how to trust the people around you, and you don't know what everyone's intentions are. And so it is hard for you to say, oh, I totally believe not everybody's going to hurt me. That might not be how people generally feel. We also have to recognize that our behavior and the things that we say and how we interact with others absolutely has the potential to injure and traumatize others, which is why we need to be careful about our communication. So we want to create some safety. We want to create personal safety. We want to create community safety. And the way to do that is to use that universal precautions in our communication, is to give somebody the freedom to speak their piece in a safe, nurturing place. So how do we do that? Oftentimes, and we do this a lot with our kids, and I see this in corrections a lot, or I see this with authority figures, they say, look at me when I'm talking to you. For some people, that's really hard. And I don't know anybody who can't actually have a conversation without eye contact. You can. You can have a conversation with someone, if they have a hard time looking at you, that really shouldn't be your point of contention. Be aware of your proximity, right? If you don't know somebody, don't get up in their face. They might not appreciate it, especially if they're in corrections. They start doing this. They backpedal. Avoid asking too many questions in a row. You're like, what's the matter? What's going on? Well, how come you look like that? How come you said that? You have a really strange tone to your voice. What's that all about? When we start doing that rapid fire questioning because we feel uncomfortable in a conversation or we feel uncomfortable about what's going on, we make people feel really defensive and that they don't really talk. They just back up, shut up, and they leave. Even physically or emotionally, they just leave the situation. When you're talking to someone, if they seem to be having a hard time, it's okay to offer a break. Do you need a minute? Take a minute to just pull yourself together. That's okay. I'm going to be here. I'm going to stay here. Go ahead and do that. Draw upon resiliency. This is one of the things I think is the most important thing to do, and everybody can do it. When someone is going through a hard time and you're with them, the first question I ask is, what did you do the last time that you were in this situation to help you get through it? Because if they're still here and they're with you, they've been through it and they've come out the other side. And so what you need to do is help them focus on their success of getting through the situation the last time, and they can do it again. You don't always have to have the answers for how to get someone through a difficult situation. You just have to ask them, what did you do the last time? And I always try to provide as many choices as possible. And if I don't know what the choices are, I will shorten my expectations until I can say, would you rather do this or this, both ending up in the same place that I wanted. Everybody always likes to say, it's going to get better, it's going to be all right, it's going to be all right. Well, you know what? Sometimes it just sucks. Things just really do. And it's okay to say that. Because sometimes things are just really bad, and if somebody needs to know that you acknowledge that too. Not all the time, not every time, but sometimes things are just bad. And sometimes just saying, I really understand that that's a bad situation for you and it feels bad is helpful. Providing clear information, like what you're doing here today. Where do I go if I need extra help? Here's where I go. Here's a pamphlet. Here's a name. Here's a card. Here's where you go. Sit with me and call them. Sometimes just giving somebody information is not enough. Sometimes you have to sit with them and make the call with them. You may have to repeat yourself more than once. It didn't take one trauma to get us to this place, and it might not take just one time saying the right thing to get out of it. You might have to do it more than once. You might have to do it with my children. I might have to do it 472 times. And they still look at you like, wow, that's new information. You have to know what are your goals and your priorities. We aren't going to fix things right away. So what we need to do is decide we're going to be safe in this situation. Maybe that's just our only goal for right now. Then we're going to get some help. Then we're going to have a discussion about this. Then we're going, maybe you need to break things down into baby steps. And sometimes there are cultural differences. Not everyone around us has the same background, history, social development. So they might have a different worldview, and we need to acknowledge that and understand it, which is why it's so helpful to say, what did you do the last time? Because it might not be what I would choose to do, but it worked for them. So there are a bunch of just guiding principles for trauma-informed care. We want to promote safety. We want to earn trust in others, embrace diversity, understand that our way is not the only way. Consider the whole person. If I just fix one little part of something and they go home to the same situation, I've done nothing. I've only done something temporary. We really need to just respect human rights. Help someone to use their strengths and their individuality to find their own answers, because trauma is individualized. Share power with them. You don't always have to be the one who knows everything. You can ask somebody, what do you do? What do you know? How can you help? Communicate with compassion. Even when the behaviors that we see are frustrating and annoying and we don't get it, and we say, when you do the same behaviors over and over again and you expect a different outcome, that's crazy. We have to understand that there's probably something else behind those repeated behaviors that's going on. And understand the prevalence and impact of trauma. It can happen to all of us at any time. So what about us? There's something called vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is trauma that impacts us not by something that's happened to us directly, but by something that we've seen or we've experienced through someone else. Like those school shootings. We aren't necessarily there, but I'll tell you what, when I sent my kids to school the next day and I got a call from the principal of the school saying that there had been a social media threat at my child's school, and they had to call the police to investigate it, it took everything in me to stay at work. Everything in me to stay at work and not say, I'm done. I'm done this week. I'm done. I'm picking up my kid and I'm going home. So when there's this accumulation of negative experiences in someone's life, it builds up and builds up and builds up in us. And sometimes we get overreactive and we act out, and sometimes we just get numb and we stop caring. We just stop caring. We're like, I can't deal with one more thing. I'm done. I'm out. And that's that burnout. We kind of lose motivation. We stay home. We get detached from others. We stop calling. We don't want to get off the couch. We don't necessarily want to cook meals. We don't want to be bothered by other people. And in my kind of a profession, it's not about if it will happen, it's really when. What are some of the contributions to trauma? Unbalanced lives. If we don't take care of ourselves, if we don't deal with the stresses, the difficulties, and all of that kind of stuff in our lives, and if things are out of balance, if we don't have as much fun as we have difficulty, then we are much more susceptible to all of those behaviors and triggers from trauma. We stop engaging with others. We necessarily don't do so well in our jobs. We don't feel so empathic when other people say I'm having a hard time. You're like, oh yeah? Well, let me tell you what a hard time is, right? When we haven't worked through our own personal loss, it's really hard for us to be sensitive to other people. So what happens? Well, we stop going to our job. We stay home. We have a drink. We don't talk to our family. We don't talk to our friends. I just need some downtime. We have really poor interactions with others. So we can get exhausted. We have sleep difficulties. We have a sense of helplessness. We can be irritable and anxious and depressed. A higher use of alcohol and drugs, a withdrawal from family and friends, and a decrease in concentration. So, what do? Can't just be all bad, right? We have to be able to do something. Good news is we can. So, it's the ABCs. The first thing is to be aware that this is happening to us. If you find yourself not talking so much, not getting on the phone, buried in your computer more times than you're talking to people, not wanting to go to work, being up all night, pacing the floor, being really irritable, that's when you say, you know what? I carry so much tension in my stomach, I get stomach aches. Or I carry tension in my shoulder. You know, every time I get really stressed, my shoulder hurts. Or I start feeling knee pain, or whatever it is. When you become aware of your symptoms, become aware of what's going on within you. Part of it is practicing mindfulness. One of the things that people do when they've been involved in a lot of traumas, they tend to catastrophize. Like everything is going to be terrible, but everything is bad. The whole world hates me, and my job is awful, and nobody likes me there, and everybody's mean, and I have no friends, and everything is the worst possible thing. But if we can stay in the moment and be more mindful of exactly where we are and what's going on right now, instead of projecting into the future, we do better. How do we do that? We do something called grounding. We ground ourselves in the moment to where we are. And that might be something like saying to yourself, okay, what's the color is the floor? What color are the walls? What am I wearing today? Just making yourself push back into the present. The second part is balance. You want to create a balance between stress and positivity, whatever that is. Whatever it means for you. Maybe you knit, maybe you run, maybe you row. Whatever it is that makes you happy, you should do some of that. You have to balance your work and your attitude, because that is the only way that you can find the way to push forward. And the last thing, this is going to be our last slide, the last thing is to create a connection. When you feel traumatized, you disconnect because being with others is too painful. Making yourself connect with someone who is safe, somebody who will listen, somebody who will be there for you is really a very powerful and strong way to move forward. Take care of your relationships with loved ones. Make appointments with them. When everybody gets really busy, you're just like, oh, we're not going to have dinner tonight. Oh, we're not going to have dinner the next night. Make yourself sit down together. Make yourself connect to your friends. Connect spiritually. Connect with groups that have the same interest as you, politically or community service kinds of things like you're doing here. Any kind of social activity that takes you outside of yourself for a little bit will help you to connect to the community and the world and not focus so much on the trauma inside of you. I think we're going to end right there. So if you guys have any questions, you can come see me afterwards. But thank you very much for listening.
I want to take some time and just thank everyone. My biggest concern is I'm going to forget to thank someone, so I apologize. I'm not intentionally leaving you out, but thank you. First of all, can I please have my committee members come up front and join me? Chris, Lisa, can you come up front? Is Adalia in the room? I would not have been able to bring this event together this year if it was not for my planning committee, and I am so grateful to Lisa and Adalia, who's not in the room, and Chris for helping bring this event together this year. So thank you so much for your dedication. Thank you very much to the partnership of NAMI Kenosha for recognizing the need in our community for this conversation, and for continuing, ensuring that this event continues not only this year but for years to come. It's really an honor to have my event in partnership with this phenomenal organization. Please make sure you stop by NAMI's table and get some info about the services that they offer. And to Jack Rose as well, thank you so much for all of your partnership. Thank you. I also want to thank our speakers, Dr. Eileen Abrams and Dan Medlock, who had to run off to his birthday party, but so grateful that they were able to join us today. To our donors, Waterfront Warehouse, The Buzz, Festival Food, Oliver's Bakery. It is Restaurant Week kicking off tonight, so when we're done here, if you're not stuffed on soup, go downtown and have something to eat. There's some great specials going on. To our orchestra students, thank you so much for the beautiful music. Our volunteers from Journey Church, Adalia, come on up here. You, Adalia. Adalia. The American Legion, they donated this space to us this year and last year, and their members helped us get everything set up today, so thank you again for that as well. To all of the businesses, the service providers, and the practitioners who are here connecting with us and sharing the information and resources, I'm so grateful to have you. And Trottier Insurance donated the projector screen to us. She wasn't able to join us, but that's great to have her sponsorship. Judge Jody Meyer was able to join us today, as well as Assembly Minority Leader Peter Barca. It's always amazing to have our political representatives and our local authorities here in support of conversations like this. The media coverage, WGDT, Frank and Kim Carmichael had us covered on their show, Channel 14. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to really make sure that this conversation gets out in our community. And thank you to you, everyone who came out today to be a part of this conversation, to learn more about how we can support the community and how we can impact each other and support each other through this conversation of PTSD. So please help yourself to more soup. There's more baked goods and coffee. The orchestra is going to play us out, and please go visit the vendors before you head out. And one last thing, in your programs there is a feedback card. It is very important for the continuation of this event that we know what worked, what didn't work, what you'd like to see in the future, and how you heard about this event. So thank you very much.